Good evening and welcome to the 15th and final presentation of Avalanche Canada's 2021-2022 webinar series. I'm Sarah Taylor and I'm your producer for the evening. Alex Cooper is also online and he'll be your moderator. He's looking out for your questions in the Q&A box. We're so stoked to have you all here for our final webinar of the season. 2 years of COVID have meant 2 years of online webinars, but we're so pleased to have been able to reach so many people across the world with these presentations. We hope you're all having a good season recreating in the backcountry, although maybe some of you have already switched to your bikes and climbing. But as you'll hear from June Island tonight, winter fun doesn't have to be over. Avalanche Canada's mission is to help educate backcountry users so you can play safe in the mountains throughout the winter and well into the spring. We want you to know more, go further, and come home. First, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted on the territory of 4 nations, the Sinixt, Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Syilx. As a national organisation, we also acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations on whose lands we live and recreate. We'd like to thank our sponsors tonight. We're really thankful that our sponsors are loyal in their financial support of us, especially during these challenging economic times. They work with us to reach new backcountry users and support the users that we already have. We have our government partners, our programme partners, our premier sponsors, supporting sponsors, and our contributors. Tonight's webinar is sponsored by Arcteryx. Arcteryx are a supporter level sponsor, and they have contributed to Avalanche Canada for over 15 years. They've sponsored Avalanche Canada fundraisers, the Canuck Splitfest, and they are a reliable contributor to our many campaigns. Arcteryx has also provided some pieces of field team uniform for the past 8 years. So we're grateful for Arcteryx's ongoing support of public avalanche safety. Stick around till the end of the session tonight for your chance to win some Arcteryx goodies. It's not just our sponsors that keep AvCan going. Donations from the public are also important in supporting our programs. If you're in a position to donate and you'd like to help out, you can use the link in the chat box now. Thank you. A few housekeeping notes. Everyone is muted automatically. To ask a question, you can raise your hand using the button in the bottom of your screen. Then I can unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question. Another way to ask a question is using the Q&A box, which is also found at the bottom of your screen. If you do have a question, please do use that Q&A box instead of the chat, because sometimes the questions do get lost in the chat. So tonight's presentation is Transition to Spring. This presentation looks at all the factors in play that you need to be aware of when you're recreating in the spring. Whether you're on skis, sleds, snowboards, snowshoes, or you're ice climbing, you need to be aware of weather factors that might affect the snowpack. Sunlight, rain, warmth, overnight freeze, these all play a part in your safety and how fun your day is. As the days get longer and spring entices more people to get into the mountains, it does bring challenges as well as benefits. So we'll be looking at how things change and some signs that the snowpack is becoming unstable at this unique time of year. Our presenter tonight is Drew Nyland from Avalanche Canada's Yukon field team. Drew is no stranger to unique cold snow climates, having developed ski programs in Baffin Island in the high Arctic for the last 7 years, as well as being an avalanche technician and ski athlete, where he's managed to build up experience, or extensive experience in fact, between the Rocky Mountains, the Pacels, Hokkaido, and the Arctic Cordillera. We're going to start off our session tonight with some quick polls. I'm also going to introduce Drew. So Drew, if you'd like to turn your camera on and you can go through the polls.
Hello,
too.
everyone.
Hi. So our first poll tonight is going to be about how much training you have. So just going to give you a little while to answer this. Remember, there's no wrong answer here. Just give it another couple of seconds, get everyone to participate. All right. I'll share those results on the screen there.
Right on. Some AST1s. Actually, some people of all levels. That's great.
Awesome. Okay, so the next poll that we have is about how you like to get into the mountains. So we're just going to share that one. give us a little info on how you like to get out there. You guys are quick on this one. Just give you another second or two, see if we can get any more participants. All right, I think that's going to be it. Let me share the results for that too.
Okay. A lot of skiers.
No ice climbers.
No ice climbers, but everyone else is represented. That's great.
All right, over to you then, Drew.
Yeah. If you stop sharing there, I can share
I'm
mine.
trying so hard.
No, it's all good. There we go. I will do this. I will do this. And does that look good there?
It does, yeah.
Okay, great. So thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, the last webinar of the season, I've been very honored to be on a couple of these this year. I really enjoy doing these. We're going to spend it takes me about a half an hour to get through this, and then I'm really happy to answer any kind of questions. The spring isn't often the time of year people talk about when they think about traveling over snow, maybe. It's usually about the winter and about kind of the normal version of this backcountry use in winter months. But there's quite a bit of nuanced pieces to traveling around in the spring. So I'm just gonna get into the whole thing. I kind of break it down into a couple things. So we're going to start by just looking at the differences between winter and spring. I know that sounds like everyone knows that already, but just some of the factors that are going to be the drivers to the whole conversation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of those drivers. So what's the actual mechanism that's making spring and the snowpack in the spring different? And then lastly, the third section is going to be the real tactile stuff, the stuff that you can take into the field to be safer out in the spring. So it's going to be a list of kind of the red flags, transitional red flags as you move from winter snow to spring snow. So let's start with the difference between winter and spring. I mean, these ones seem really obvious, but it might not be obvious until we go through all the mechanisms, exactly why that matters to avalanche problems. So in the winter, it's shorter days. The sun is lower in the sky. And when I mean lower in the sky, I mean it's nearer the southern horizon, which is important, believe it or not. And it's cooler. It doesn't have to be cooler. We can have cold springs. And I think it's important that everyone think about this as a transition. This is a long gray scale. Things are going from how they are in the winter to spring. But these transitions can also happen in big warm periods that we've had a couple of those really, really warm periods kind of come through southern British Columbia, and even up here where I am up in the Yukon, we're getting those as well. So those are kind of the big differences when it comes to avalanche stuff. There's some other differences is the kind of the feeling of the snow, the way we recreate out there. That's a picture of me snowmobiling. Definitely in the winter, that's the kind of mental image we have of the winter, and that's my partner Emily on the other side skiing in the spring. And so we know that there are differences, whether it's just in how we're feeling the snow or the whole structure of the snow. We know it's different, and I'm going to hopefully break down a couple of the reasons why. So let's talk about first winter snow. This is not an exhaustive list of the things that make winter snow, but they're kind of the highlights. So it's below zero, and when I mean below zero, I mean the air temperature is below zero. So the snowpack is often granular. It's little pieces. They fall as snowflakes, and then they slowly change into other little crystals in the snowpack. But the air temperature, we don't get that like free running water typically. If you have a really warm event, sure, then it's a spring-like condition in the winter. It has nothing to do with the equinox or anything like that. It's just this big grayscale as it changes from cool temperatures to warm. But the winter snow is typically defined as being colder than 0, freezing. And then another big piece is that it's layered. Now, spring snow is layered too. And when we say layered, I mean that if you dig into the snowpack, there's layers. And really, it's like a history book of the whole season up to that point. You can look at all the little layers, and there are many. If you get a light kind of behind the snow, if you cut into it, you can see almost every storm for the first bit. And then as you get deeper, it's still layered. You can still feel little layers, and it changes from place to place as you move down in the snowpack. They might not be as defined as they are in the upper snowpack, but it's still heavily layered. And so that's like a big structural piece of how the winter snow is different than the spring. So this one is just the avalanche problems that are typical to winter. Any of the listed avalanche problems can happen any time of year, but the typical ones that we're dealing with in the winter are wind slabs. So this is snow that has fallen, or light snow that's sitting on the surface that gets blown along and deposited in thicker areas and become a problem. When they're made for the first 24, 48 hours ish, they're often quite touchy. That's a really winter snow problem. Persistent slabs. So this is one of those layers that I was describing as they get buried in the snow that has a weakness to it. It's weaker than its surrounding shapes and crystal forms, and it can be a problem as it gets buried. And the further it gets buried, obviously, the bigger the problem. So persistent slabs are a winter slab problem. And then deep persistent is the exact same thing, but as those storm layers, or any layer really, as it gets buried and buried and buried deeper in the snowpack, then it becomes a deep persistent problem. So it's survived all the crushing forces of the snow, and it's made it quite low down into the snow. Storm slabs. So this is like a new snow slab. So the snow is falling. It's new snow. It's cold in the winter. So it's fluffy maybe, but it has just enough cohesion to stick together and make a slab. And it can be really soft. It can be quite hard as well, but it typically quite soft. And that's like a common winter avalanche problem, is you get these storm slabs. And then loose dry. So this is the only one in the family of loose avalanches typical in the winter. And it's when the snow, you can imagine all these little snowflakes falling down, and they just touch on the little ends of their arms, right? And that's really all that's holding them together. And in a loose dry avalanche, they just don't have enough connectivity, in contrast to any of these other slab avalanches where some mechanism has like really driven them together and got them stuck, and they're cohesive. In a loose dry avalanche, really it's like sand running off of a sand dune. It's come to a certain point where it can no longer hold itself up, and it slides off. And in the winter, we have these loose dries, sometimes referred to as sloughing as well. So those are all kind of, though, like I said, all of the avalanche problems can happen in the winter. Those are kind of the big drivers. Spring snow. So daytime is above 0. This is important, and this will be a recurring theme throughout my entire talk. Will be daytime temperatures above 0, and somewhat above 0 for many days in a row start to melt the surface of the snow. This is why my partner here, Emily, in this photo, isn't sinking anymore. So it's made of crust. It's made of thick crust from the daytime warming or the sun, and it's preventing anything from impacting the snow below it. And then fewer layers. So like I said, the spring snow still has layers in it, but in the spring, once the spring is kind of happening, which we're not quite there yet up here, but I'm sure many folks down south are, you can often describe the snowpack in kind of 3 parts. So it's like the surface, and the surface snow is likely a crust, a thick crust, that's maybe moist on top if it's the middle of the day, or maybe it's dry and frozen on top if it's nighttime. The center of the snowpack, which might be described as the dry snow or the cold snow below the crust. And then often there's some kind of weaker crystals near the ground, sugary stuff near the ground. And there may be other little layers in there, or hidden little layers. If you're not quite fully into that spring snow, as you're transitioning through, like I said, it's a grayscale. It's not one day it's this and the next day it's this. As you're transitioning through, it'll be some kind of mix of the two. But when you're deep into the spring, you've got a crust, a thick supportive crust on top that melts and freezes every night with the sun coming up and going down. The middle of the snow, which is dry and cool still, and then the bottom of the snow. So fewer layers denotes spring snow. And then the avalanche problems that go along with the spring. And like I said, you can have a completely winter event that happens in the spring, but the ones that are more typical, wet slab. So this is when something, be it the sun or free running water from rain or melt or something, gets into the snowpack and cuts it, kind of. It breaks the snow, and the snow is still connected enough to be a giant slab. So it cuts the snow off and makes a giant slab avalanche. And we call that a wet slab. Persistent slabs. So when I was describing them in the winter, they're a buried interface, a weak layer that gets buried in the snow. But you can imagine in the spring when the first punch of sun gets them, or the first really warm day, that those persistent layers, those buried layers, old storms maybe, get affected for the first time. That's going to be a moment in that transition where we're not really in spring, we're not really in winter, and we're really quite worried about these buried problems. And then to continue on that is those deep persistent problems. These might be the ones right down at the bottom. The first time the heat and the sun and the water get all the way down there, we're likely in a situation where we're thinking about deep persistent slabs. That's a spring problem. Storm slabs, that one might surprise people a little bit, but of course we do get spring storms. It's not just all blue sky and corn skiing. So a storm comes in. If that snow falls overnight, we're thinking about what it's falling on, and what it's falling on is likely a really hard crust. And we're not going to get that kind of nice bond where it's cooler snow with cooler snow falling on it and they kind of stick together. We're going to have a shiny surface and a load of maybe 10 or 15 centimeters of snow, and we're going to have a storm slab problem. In that next day, when things warm up, that storm slab problem may disappear almost completely. It doesn't have to necessarily if it doesn't warm enough, but it could. So those are things to think about. That's a spring problem. And then wet loose. So its partner in the winter is dry loose, and a wet loose avalanche is exactly that. Same idea of these grains close together that were once frozen together likely. And then as free running water, heat, or the sun get in there, it breaks those bonds apart, and it's just like a big slurpee. It comes down. It can't hold itself up anymore. So you see wet loose avalanches. And wet loose avalanches, sometimes people think of this like pinwheeling, or like little snowballs that roll out of rocks. That's a wet loose avalanche. But wet loose avalanches can also be the entire snowpack that just kind of is crumbling down. So those are some kind of differences in the like winter snow to spring snow. When you hear people talking about that change over time, this is what they're talking about. It's as it transitions to a more homogeneous, more uniform snowpack with a crust on top. And then cornices, of course. So cornices are those big, pillowy, giant chunks of snow that live up on ridge lines in the lee, or on sharp breaks in terrain. And cornices in the spring are getting cooked on the south side of them, and they can be very unpredictable. And because the surface is likely frozen underneath them, they can run very far. You can imagine a boulder rolling off the side of the mountain can cross a valley or go very far. So cornices get a lot of respect in the spring. You give them they're a fair berth. You want to give them some space for sure. So one more thing that changes that's very pertinent to us at Avalanche Canada is that the forecast changes. So up in the top left here, you see a common looking forecast. This is for the Yukon. If you're not familiar with the Yukon, we don't have a below tree line elevation band because the trees don't grow so far up. So we're kind of already at tree line, just where we can recreate. So that's why there's no rating, sorry, below tree line. But this is like a normal looking forecast. This is what you'd expect to see in the winter. You'd go out and day to day, these change and they alter over time, and they kind of go from low, which is colored in green, all the way up to extreme, which is colored in black, but all the way up to high, which is colored in red. So those are kind of the green is low, red is high avalanche hazard. And that's how we denote that. And all the people that filled in their poll that said they were in their AST1 have seen that before. You know, they're bought into this forecast. This is what they're looking for. So at some point in time in the spring, the page will change. It's not that there's no forecast anymore. It's that the forecast is so dependent on small things like the temperature of the air and if the sun is out or not, that it's fluctuating daily between green and red. So green being low, red being high. I actually really like the icon because it shows well, it doesn't show everything that's going on, but it shows quite a lot. So it shows the red side with an avalanche and a thermometer with the temperature going up. And on the green side, it shows the temperature going down and no avalanche coming down. You'll hear this from me a couple of times, but if you want to recreate in the spring, I would suggest buying a thermometer. I think it's a good thing. The write-up here is really smartly done, I think, by likely some very intelligent colleague at Avalanche Canada. But I'll just read the top line because I think it makes sense. The avalanche danger is variable and can change and can range from low to high. That's really important. So really, it's so granular. It changes so quick that only being out there is going to be able to define whether it's low or high. And we don't really give a lot of middle ground in this little icon, which is great because often if the snow is breaking down and it's hot, it's high avalanche hazard. And if it's not doing any of those things and it's really hard and you're walking on it and staying up, it's probably closer to low. So it's a good icon to think about when you're out there. So we jump into the second piece, which is all about mechanism. I apologize. I really like this stuff. So there's some graphs and charts, and I think they're all really interesting. If they're not making sense to anyone, please shoot a question in the chat box. I think we're going to save them right till the end, but I'm happy to jump back and flip back through slides to show people exactly what I was talking about. So to start with, average temperatures. This is important. This is a mechanism. Temperature is a mechanism for avalanches. So we see here, this is for the White Pass. This is where I recreate, just outside Whitehorse in the Yukon. And you see that if you move along the graph from left to right, that April, our daytime highs are nearing 0. And then as we switch to May, our lows are near 0. So I would say, of course, it changes every year, that looking at this graph, that the true spring skiing here would be April and May, kind of, but likely vary on either side of that a little bit. So longer days, I like this graph a lot, though it might not work for you, and that's totally fine. But this is showing how much sunlight there is in a day. And the various colors of blue or the various kinds of twilight. But as we transition from the lightest blue to the first shade below it, that's where the sun goes behind the horizon. So when we're thinking about solar radiation, that's the heat from the light of the sun impacting the snow, we need to know how much daylight there is. So that's another big driver as we go from winter to spring, is how much daylight there is. So you can see here, if you're not familiar with the Yukon, that in January, we have approximately 6 hours of the sun over the horizon, which isn't a whole lot. But that's okay, because we've got a lot of twilight on either side, right? So twilight is the time where it's still light out, but the sun's below the horizon. But you'll see as we switch into April here, which we just talked about, might be a time that we're starting to think that the snowpack's gone to a spring snowpack. Just looking at this graph, you know, it looks like we have 12 to 14 hours of daylight, which is quite a bit more than down south. So we're getting solar input into the snow for a lot longer in the day. That's driving things. And that's something I'm thinking about when I'm out there, is how long is the sun on a slope? Okay, I really like this one. So this is if you're a Whitehorse person, this is the White Pass, that's Fraser Chutes. If you're not a Whitehorse person, that's totally fine. So on the left, you see a triangle. On the right of that triangle is a yellow line, and on the left of that triangle is an orange line. That's a program that's just about the sun, and that's showing where the sun rises and where it sets on December 21st. So the sun is rising. You can imagine that map is north is up. So the sun is rising at southeast or southeast maybe, and then it goes through the south and then sets again in the southwest. So if you're in this place already with your personal avalanche understanding, where you're thinking about aspects, you know, very few aspects are getting sunlight in the true winter, January, February, right? It's really kind of south. Anything that includes south has sunlight on it, but almost nothing else. We transition to March 20th on the right, sorry. And we see that instead of a triangle now, we have a flat line. So that's the sun rising due east, coming all the way through the south, and then actually setting just north of west. So all of a sudden, when I'm thinking about which slopes have been impacted by the sunlight, I'm thinking about everything that isn't the truest of north. So east, southeast, south, southwest, and west are all getting sunlight of some caliber. So I'm building this picture. It's like as we transition into spring, we're getting more light on more slopes, and we're getting longer days. So the south, the truest south, is actually getting a lot of sun for a long period of time that could be heating it up and damaging the little bonds between the snowflakes quite a bit. Okay, more graphs. So that's December 21st. I'll talk about the graph in a second. That's March 20th, and that's April 29th. So what this graph shows is the black line is the horizon, and the little yellow dots are the sun. On the bottom is denoted in time. So you see at 2 p.m. on December 21st, the sun is approximately 7 degrees above the horizon and is only up for the 6 hours we talked about. So the sun is very low. This is the horizon. The sun sits right on the edge of the horizon. That's the winter. As we transition, we're talking about spring now. We start thinking about the sun being higher in the sky now. Why does that matter? We'll talk about it a little bit in a second here. But as the sun gets higher, it's more able to impact the snow. So you see that on March 20th, it's 30 degrees above the horizon. And then on April 29th, it's 45 degrees. If you ask around, I think, people seem to think that the snow magically disappears from valley bottoms or all valley bottoms around late April. And I think it has something to do with how high the sun is in the sky and how it can affect flat ground. We'll talk about that right here. So the angle of incidence is what we're talking about. And so I know there's like, it looks like math in the corner there, but disregard. All you need to see is that the light from the sun is trying to impact what it's hitting. The sharper the angle, the more it can impact. So the angle of incidence is the angle at which the sun rays hit the ground. So steep angles, sharp angles can absorb more sun radiant heat. Okay, this might all seem like stuff that has nothing to do with avalanches. Stick with me. In the winter, you will often see in the avalanche forecast, steep solar or steep south has a sun crust on it. So why does the steep south and not just the regular old south have a crust on it midwinter? It's because the sun has to be a certain angle to what it's trying to impact. And if it's kind of less than 30 degrees, it doesn't quite deliver that radiant heat into the snow. It bounces off. So when the sun, is really low in the sky, the light actually is bouncing off and it's not delivering the radiant heat. As the sun rises in the like over months in the spring, as it gets higher in the sky, it can impact mellower slopes more. And that's what I was talking about with somewhere in late April, you get this moment where the sun can impact flat ground at 45 degrees, which is plenty for the sun to impact the snow with its radiant energy. So the angle of incidence, really all the take-home piece here, if this is all feel like way out there, the take-home piece here is that in the spring, we drop the word steep out of the forecast and we drop the idea of only steep surfaces having crusts on them. And really we start thinking about the south as a whole. All of it's being affected by the sun equally, regardless of how steep it is. The sun is able to get its radiant heat delivered to the snow and then melt the bonds. That might have seemed like a lot. Okay, here's another one that's got arrows and numbers. This one's easy. Albedo is the ability of an object to absorb heat, radiant heat. High albedo surfaces like snow or things that are bright white or shiny reflect a lot of that away just naturally. So snow is already prone to reflecting that heat away, in contrast to dark colored things like rocks. So you'll often see in forecasts steep rocky start zones for wet avalanches. So why are they starting at those rocks? It's because the sun is able to warm those rocks up. Those rocks are then transmitting that heat into the snow around them, breaking down the bonds. All of what I'm talking about here is just different ways the sun or heat manage to break the bonds in the snowpack and cause a weakness to develop or to trigger an already existing weakness. So those are the mechanisms that are changing from winter to spring. It's all revolving around the sun and heat. We need those things to help make the snowpack more uniform in the spring so we can make good decisions in the spring. We need that. We need the surface to melt and for it to refreeze at night. We need that. That's what makes spring skiing so great. When that surface piece thaws out again, it makes for really great riding or skiing. Because that's happened, our red flags change. Our winter red flags remain, but we have new ones that we're really, really thinking about when we go out there. And this is the part where what's in my head is hopefully coming out and explaining to you what you should be looking for when you're out trying to travel in the spring and do it safely. So red flags in a transitional snowpack. Above freezing temperatures. Okay, so every day there's above freezing temperatures likely in the spring, right? So how is this a red flag? It's a red flag for a number of reasons, but to know if it's showing its red flag is we need to carry a thermometer. It's really simple in my mind to be walking up a steep hill, skinning up, and I've got it's sunny out, but it's -2 and I'm just sweating buckets. It is hot. I know it's hot, but it's not above 0, and that's a real threshold moment. Conversely, if it's +2 and howling wind and I'm on the shady side of something and I'm poorly dressed and we've been sitting around for way too long, I'm cold, but it's above 0. So the snow doesn't care as much what it's doing. It starts breaking down at 0. So we need to carry a thermometer to identify this red flag in the first place. Did it freeze last night is part of the above freezing temperatures that we need to think about. So did it freeze last night is really about how thick that crust became. So there are two kind of ways to know if it froze last night. One would be to look up a weather station. And there are a number of weather stations posted on the Avalanche Canada website, avalanche.ca, and there are many others. Often ski hills have them that show a representative elevation. And so you'll look in those places to see if it froze the night before. And then if you don't have access to those kinds of things, like myself, if you're living in a more remote place or a place that doesn't have as much infrastructure, you may not know. So to figure that out, you're going to go out and see how thick that crust is, because that's going to give you a gauge. It's not going to give you a number value, but it's going to give you a gauge of how frozen the top is. If so, for how long? So did it melt and freeze yesterday, or did it stay frozen for a couple days and that crust is getting really thick? The take home here is that we need to know how thick that crust is. This is an extra red flag for me. If it didn't freeze last night, there still may be a crust, but I want to start knowing how long it's been since it had a really good hard freeze. We'll talk about this in a bit, but if we're not getting the kind of freeze we're hoping for, so like if we're not able to, if we're kind of breaking through every couple steps, or if our track's dropping out from underneath our snow machine, we want to be taking extra caution at this point. And those above freezing temperatures are really the most omnipresent, the thing that's going to affect every slope the most. Factor in the spring that's going to break apart those bonds, like we've been talking about. The winter has, the wind and the cold and the melt freeze has all mashed these snow crystals together, but they're just held on by little corners and little arms. And as they start melting out, we can all imagine how this would happen. They start melting apart, they become weak. So above freezing temperatures, in a way where they're affecting that crust and the rest of the snowpack, are a red flag. And sinking, exactly what I was just talking about. So sinking, like breaking through, post-holing, that feels bottomless, wallowing, any of these words or these feelings are sinking to me. And we can potentially forecast when that's going to happen by tracking the thickness of the frozen surface. What do I mean by that? So when we're out skinning, where we in the parking lot, maybe in the morning, we make a note. It doesn't have to be in a book, but we make a mental note of how thick the surface is, how thick that crust is. And then as the day goes on and we change elevation bands, we keep an eye on how thick it is. But as we get to a place where we're either doing the same thing over and over again, or we get onto a ridge or something, some kind of static kind of area, we start tracking its thickness over time. So if we got up to a ridge and we're having lunch, and at the beginning of lunch it was 15 centimeters, and then at the end of lunch it's 10 centimeters, we're starting to think that that breakdown is happening right now, and it's happening really quite quickly, and we want to start making a plan for that. So that's a way we could potentially forecast that we're about to sink, or we're going to wallow through the snow. And then once that surface has broken down, the snowpack will lose strength quickly. So this won't be a slow thing. It'll be quite slow as it's breaking down the crust. The crust is strong. It's reflecting light away. The temperature can't get through it. It's solid, so it's quite strong. But once it breaks down and that heat can get into that cold snow center we were talking about, it will break down really, really quickly, and we'll start to feel this like, oh, I can't stay up anymore. I can't keep my skis on top of the snow anymore. Or I'm snowboarding down, and all of a sudden my turns are going just really deep into the snow. We're starting to think about the snow has completely lost its spring structure, and now there's water potentially running through the dry snow in the center, and we're thinking about persistent slab or deep persistent slab avalanches. This is a tricky one. Cloudy skies at night I wouldn't put them in the same class of red flag as maybe sinking is, but cloudy skies at night are a driver in the spring. So clouds can insulate. I'm sure everyone's noted that before. It's been a really warm day, blue skies, and then at night these clouds come in and they just seem to hold the heat in. They just blanket everything, and it just doesn't get as cold as we would like overnight. So cloudy skies at night, if you're out camping, if you're doing a traverse, it's a good thing to watch for. You know, you got to get up to go pee or whatever it is in the middle of the night. You go out, you look, there's no stars, you're thinking, there might be not as much freeze as I had hoped for tomorrow. And then clear skies, so stars at night is what you are hoping for, make a stronger refreeze, partially due to the snowpack losing long wave radiation. I spared us the graphs on how that all works, but just so you know, the Earth is losing its long wave radiation and it's making the snowpack cooler on clear nights. So cloudy skies at night are something I'm watching for when I'm thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow, or I'm looking at if the skies were cloudy last night on what I'm doing today. Wind. So I didn't include, this is a bit of a tricky one. I did not include wind wind slab in the common problems in the spring. And that's not what I'm going to allude to here, but the wind can maintain the surface temperature of the snow. So it's a beating down sun, but the wind is blowing across the surface and it's cooling it slightly. We're talking about like little bits here. We're not thinking about like a strong wind keeping it 5 or 10 degrees cooler, maybe a degree or two cooler, but it can do that. It can keep the snowpack slightly cooler. Conversely, warm wind, which if you're maybe from the Rockies or another place that's near a continental plateau, you can get an upslope wind. In the Rockies, they call it the Chinook wind. And it's a warm wind from the non-dominant direction. And warm wind has an amazing ability to decimate the snowpack. So not only is it warm, it's got pressure and it's moving moisture away. So it can degrade a snowpack really, really fast. So the wind is a red flag for different reasons in the spring than it might be in the winter. We're not thinking about a lot of loose snow sitting around in the spring, right? The surfaces, as we talked about, is this hard crust, and in many aspects is that. So the wind doesn't really have anything to pick up and make into a new wind slab. Rain. Seems obvious. It's another mechanism, you know, free running water, the water gets into the snowpack, it breaks those little bonds apart. Makes sense, right? Rain at low elevations, I don't typically, me personally, don't typically go out when it's raining, but there are a lot of places where that's totally the norm. It's not the norm up here in the Yukon, but leaving the parking lot in the rain on the assumption that you're going to pass through the freezing level and you're going to be in snow shortly, or not so shortly, depending on where you are. But rain can either be the snow breaking apart because the rain's falling on it, or, like I said, a storm slab is very much a spring problem. So we think of a big spring storm coming in, it's raining at valley bottom, we're all glum about it. But we go up high and there's 10, 20, 30 centimeters of new snow. What's all that snow sitting on? It's likely sitting on a shiny, hard crust. And we know that that bond isn't going to be great until, of course, it warms up and all of that becomes the new surface, which will then just be a big, thick crust. A little bit of rain can turn into quite a lot of snow. This is a general measurement, a rule of thumb, but 1 millimeter of rain past the freezing level is typically about 10 centimeters of snow. I mean, that can range quite a bit depending if it's really, really wet snow or if it's really cold up high and it's very dry, you can get more than that. But if you were just to like make a guess and you saw 3 millimeters of rain in the forecast, a reasonable guess would be to say that 3 centimeters of snow are going to fall. So 1 centimeter of rain, which is actually quite a lot of rain, would be 10 centimeters of snow. And then rain right at the mountaintop is, I'm unaware of people that recreate when it's raining up at mountaintop, but you may get stuck out there, especially if you're doing long spring days, spring trips, or a freak storm comes through that's warmer than you had thought. You may get rain at high elevations, and rain on a snowpack that isn't really, really hardened like deep late into spring, once most of the snowpack is a crust in high elevation areas, rain is going to do some real damage real quick. It's going to be that same idea we were talking about with free running water breaking the bonds apart. So we want to be really cautious when it's raining on the slopes that we intend to travel on. And then of course, this carries over from winter, but avalanche activity. If we're seeing avalanches, we're thinking avalanches can happen. Avalanches mean avalanches can happen. The spring can be a little different. I'll go over a couple. I've got a couple photos of avalanches right at the end here that we can look at, and I can explain a bit about how they may differ a little bit. But wet, loose avalanches are kind of the ones I'm talking about. So we're back to imagining our crust. The surface is getting moist from the sun, the heat, the rain, whatever it is. And right away, they'll start falling down in little pinwheels and stuff. Those are avalanches, but they may not get my senses all tingling, right? I might not be like, ooh, it's getting really bad out here. But wet slabs are a completely different story. If I'm starting to see avalanches, if I'm starting to see avalanches that are breaking out and coming out as a slab from the heat or the sun, I'm starting to think about the way I'm getting home. If I've crossed a valley with any kind of southern exposure, I'm starting to think about that really heavily. Wet slab avalanches are very destructive and can be very large. And then cornices. I don't wait for the first cornice to fall to think cornices can fall. I know they can fall all winter, but in the spring especially, they are much less predictable than the snowpack because they're so unique to each individual spot, how thick they are, what the terrain looks like. So if I see cornice falls, I'm then positive. I'm no longer quite sure they can fall at any point, but I'm then positive that they're triggerable in the area I'm in. So here's some wet, loose avalanches. I just thought this would be a nice way to like wrap up the avalanche activity piece. And these wet, loose avalanches are probably a sign that the riding in this particular area is just past where you're in that like typical corn skiing. It's just gotten a bit warm. It's starting to degrade. It's starting to get a little deeper into the snow, and it's starting to pull down. But these avalanches, you can see they start in a steep rocky area, likely have had some albedo effect contribute to why those have tumbled down. So they're not hugely indicative to me that this snowpack is totally crumbling. Whereas if I was walking across this particular slope and I couldn't stay on the surface, I was just sinking in, that would be the end of my day in that area. For me, I would say it's completely broken down and I don't need to be there anymore. This is a picture of an avalanche that I thought was kind of interesting. And when I'm talking about the last mind-bending thing, when I talk about this transition from spring, or from winter to spring rather, it's often seen over time but really there's so many components to it. So in this photo, that's a cold snow winter avalanche. It's a persistent slab avalanche in the top that as it's come down, it's crossed the freezing level somewhere. And then in the bottom part, that's actually a wet slide. It just took the snow out with it. So when we think of that transition from winter to spring, it absolutely happens over time. January, February, typically very cold snow, skiing, winter snow. March is very transitional. And then April, May are spring, generally, not hard lines here, grayscale. But to put that out into the terrain is another skill. So the north side of things, the north facing side, can be cold winter snow well into April. And the southern side of slopes can be very springy in early March, late February, depending on where you are, as well as the top of the mountain can be cold snow, and the tree line, below tree line area can be well into its spring structure. They're just some ideas. There's a lot that goes into managing spring hazard and spring avalanches. But learning about them is the first step. It was very nice to see that so many people had their AST courses. Taking further education on these things, jumping on AvSavvy is a great one. That's a website that has an online tutorial about all kinds of things. It doesn't have a whole lot about spring, but there are pieces in there. And then getting out with a guide potentially into some of these, these more niche courses that are coming out as more and more people are recreating in the backcountry, and really learn about how the spring is different. It's a dynamic time, but it's also just an awesome time to be out there. It's warm, the days are long, and the mountains are just especially beautiful that time of year. That's what I have for everyone. I would be very happy to answer questions if people have any, and hopefully I can answer them. But thank you all for coming. It's always fun to do these.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Drew. It was a fantastic presentation, and I think I saw a shorter version last year, so it was great to see kind of extended like that. We don't actually have any questions that I've seen, but I will open up the floor right now to see if any would come in. If you do have a question, just put it in the Q&A box, and yeah, Drew will keep an eye out and ask it. But yeah, we'll just give a couple of minutes or about a few seconds here to see if anything pops up. But otherwise, oh, there you go. From Ryan Baricello, he asks, do you have a guide on how long it takes a snowpack to recover after a deep rain?
Yeah, the factors that go, that's a great question. I mean, after you get a big rain, you're waiting for the freeze. You're waiting for the next big freeze, and you can measure just like you would measure any big refreeze. And I would do that by going to wherever it is you want to recreate that day and getting into no consequence terrain and trying to measure how thick it's refrozen. The rain going all the way through the snowpack is fine so long as it all refreezes. If conversely it doesn't, and there's still really moist, kind of sugary, broken apart, wet, crystally snow in there, it hasn't frozen completely. It hasn't, what I would say, recovered from that event. I admittedly don't have a lot of experience in like really warmer snow climates, but that's how I would approach that problem. I would measure the crust thickness on top, make sure it's carrying my weight, plus, and then wait for a good but short warm up to kind of ski the corn on top of it.
Great, thanks, Drew. Another question from Jennifer Joyce. She wants to know if you have, she's looking for a recommendation for a travel thermometer.
Yeah, this is actually the second time I've had this question
think so,
about
yeah.
thermometers. I think every brand of Avalanche kind of equipment, well, that's probably not true. I think Backcountry Access makes some. I think a company called Brooks Range makes some. Mountain Equipment Co-op carries them. Personally, I like carrying a digital one. They're just kind of faster, and I'm sure of what it's saying. If you're really good at reading an alcohol one, I also carry an alcohol thermometer just in case the batteries die in my digital one. But a good like one that has like a little probe on the end of it, and something that's like not too something you're actually going to carry is going to be the key point here. But yeah, outdoor stores should have them, and I know for a fact Mountain Equipment Co-op carries them.
Great, thanks. So that's, I was about to say it's the last question, but I guess Brian Hyde wants to know if you've ever found yourself in a rapid warming situation where you needed to get off the mountain or aspect promptly, and what advice you have for that.
That actually hits probably like way too close to home. Yeah, I definitely have. I think talking about these kind of like, I would say when I feel those red flags happen, that they're relatively high stress situations. So I think you need to fall back on your communication with your group, making sure that the entire group knows that this is a problem. You're like, we're no longer in recreation mode, we're like get home safe mode. So to start with, I would say good communication. And then my advice for getting off of the mountain is hugely dependent on which mountain and what kind of piece of terrain you're in. But I would say you're in this idea of linking up the smallest possible terrain you can, and avoidance is your number one goal. So whatever it takes to kind of move safely, it's no longer about the enjoy, like, is this going to be a good run or something like that. And I think most of that's going to come down to just the whole group understanding that it's a problem. And once you've made that decision, use the collective brain power of the group you're in to pick the lowest consequence terrain to get down. So yeah, and then some more like tactile pieces on that. If this is like an event you're thinking of, is like high ground, high points of terrain where nothing's above you, no overhead hazard, and likely on shaded slopes. If you can travel on north aspects, north facing or shady areas, if it's the sun and the air temperature that's making the snowpack fall apart on you.
Well, thanks, Drew. Anna Braun has asked if you can talk about the temperature gradient in the snow and how it differs in the spring. So that's getting pretty technical there, but maybe
yeah, I can do a couple seconds on that. Yeah, so the temperature gradient, that's a great question. It is a somewhat technical question, but the temperature gradient for folks that are still a student of all this stuff, like I am, is it's the temperature measured through the snowpack from the ground to the surface. And the temperature gradient is typically drawn on like a line, and it shows how far away from a normal gradient, which would be 1 degree for every 10 centimeters throughout the snowpack. That would be like a normal-ish gradient. And the spring temperature gradient is driven by a couple things. One is that there's this huge fluctuation in day and nighttime temperatures. So the temperature gradient really only affects the uppermost part of the snow because it's so drastically changing. And then secondly, if we're into this place talking about temperature gradients, this may go over some people's heads, that's fine, but that the top is a crust, so we're not getting the vapor transfer through the snowpack like we might normally get in a winter snowpack. So we're thinking about those issues relative to temperature gradient, if that's what the question's about, like facets or those kinds of things around that crust right at the top, on the top and the bottom of it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, temperature gradient's a pretty complicated topic. I'll see if I can find a good link to put in the chat for those who may not have quite understood that, almost a bit like me, but thanks. Okay, second question from Ryan Baricello, asking, once the crust starts to warm up during the day and change into corn, what depth of corn snow starts to make you nervous?
It's that these are all so, it's so hard not to answer every question with depends. But it depends. The corn snow, if we're both talking the same language here, is when the top of the crust has melted. It's usually not more than a couple centimeters. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be good to ski 10 centimeters of corn snow. I just don't think it would be great. So usually I'm just trying to ski a little bit of it. That's when it's best. That's when it kind of feels like a groomer at a ski hill to me. I would feel like there were large red flags if I was breaking through the entire crust. And I would start feeling nervous, if you will. I don't know if I would put it that way. I would start really considering what I was doing. If I had been measuring the crust throughout the day and we were getting to a point where the crust was thin enough that I was not going to be supported by it anymore. So it's really a change over time, not a measurement that I'm like, oh, it's 10 centimeters, I better get off the slope. It's more like, oh, the crust was 20 centimeters thick this morning, it's 10 now, and in 10 minutes it's 5. It's like, it's time to get out of here.
Great, thanks, Drew. All right, I think this might be the last question from Haley, who was at the last webinar. So at the last webinar, yeah, you mentioned very early starts during spring conditions, like getting up in the middle of the night, starting to walk at 3 a.m. What are your thoughts on traveling in the dark and judging conditions accurately? That's an interesting twist on this.
Yeah, great. I love people thinking about how this actually would apply to them. These webinars are awesome. There's so much information that comes out in them, but taking them home with you and trying to think about what you're actually doing out there. I mean, that's a huge step in avalanche education and just mountain travel in general. So good on you for thinking about how that would actually play out. When it comes to traveling in the dark, you can't see what's above you. It's very much like traveling in the white, a big whiteout or something. So navigation skills, redundant navigation skills like carrying a GPS, being able to assess the snow directly under my feet. I don't think that really changes at night because I would have a headlamp, and if I really needed to see something directly in front of me, I could. And so it really turns into how much route planning have I done? What do I know what's above me? Because those are starting to be the things that I want to know about when I'm traveling at night. So I would say if you're just getting into this kind of thing, is good route plan, know what's above you. So when you ask yourself, is there overhead hazard here? You can answer that confidently, not, oh, there might be. It's yes, there is, or no, there isn't. And I'm worried about that, or I'm not. So those are kind of some of the night travel stuff. If you're looking for how to actually do it, I would say some ski crampons go a long way, and a really, really big headlamp, and some good trip partners that are up for it.
All right, thanks so much. That was our last question. So I think say thanks once again, Drew, for the great presentation and answering those questions. And now I guess I get to have some fun giving away a couple of prizes.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Sarah, do you have the prizes to show off, or maybe she can hold them up? So we've got...
They're just in bags, so I'm going to unwrap them probably very loudly, but you won't see them otherwise because the light reflects in the plastic. So we have...
All right, we've got a nice hat from Arcteryx, our sponsor for tonight's webinar. And that one goes to Kareem Nur Mohammed. So congratulations, Kareem. And as I just put in the chat, if you hear your name called and you won a prize, please email producer@avalanche.ca with your mailing address to claim it so we can send it to you. All right, what's the next up? Oh, you got a nice little beanie. That'll fit nicely. That'll be a nice one to wear in the spring, nice and light for warm days. And we are going to give that out to Marissa Hindemith. So congratulations, Marissa. As I said, email producer@avalanche.ca to claim your prize. And finally, we've got an Arcteryx neck tube. let's see what that looks like. Oh, there you go. So this one is going out to Clement Chung. Congratulations, Clement. So yeah, once again, thanks everybody for coming out, and congratulations to those who won prizes. Yeah, and I will hand it over to Sarah to finish things off.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Drew. That was a great presentation. I know I definitely feel more prepared now, and hopefully everyone else does too. Thank you again, like I said, for coming this evening. There are so many resources on our website, avalanche.ca, to help you learn more about avalanche safety. We also have avsavvy.ca, which is our online tutorial. I know that was mentioned in the presentation, but it's definitely worth a look. Hopefully you managed to grab some of those links from the chat box while we were all talking. So we appreciate, obviously, everyone's interest in avalanche safety. You can support essential programs like what we're doing tonight and our forecasts from as little as $10. You can click the link in the chat box now if you'd like to donate. And that's a wrap for our webinar series this year. We truly appreciate the opportunity to use this online platform to reach people. And we'll be back next season with a new series. Until then, you can stay in touch with us through our website and our social media feeds. Good night, everyone, and thanks again for coming.